There are cities that wear their scars in silence. Rochester, New York, in the early 1970s was one of them. The hum of factories, the chatter of corner stores, the laughter of children carrying groceries home. On the surface, life went on as it always had. But under that ordinary rhythm, the city was being stalked by something cold and deliberate, something that would come to be remembered by a name both strange and unforgettable: the Alphabet Killer. It started with a child who never made it home. Her name was Carmen Colon, 10 years old. She lived with her grandparents and her extended family in Rochester's Bull's Head neighborhood. Carmen was known to be curious and restless, a little girl who seemed to carry a boundless energy. But on the evening of November 16th, 1971, that energy was swallowed by something far darker. She had been sent on a small errand, something so simple it felt safe. She was asked to pick up a prescription from a local pharmacy, less than a mile from her home. The kind of errand a child her age might do dozens of times in her life. But Carmen never came back. When the minutes turned into hours, her grandparents began calling around, checking with neighbors, searching the familiar streets. As night fell, their unease turned into dread. Carmen was gone. Hours later, drivers along Interstate 490 reported something so disturbing it would haunt them for years. They claimed they saw a little girl, her hair flying in the wind, her face pale with panic, running along the shoulder of the highway. Some remembered her glancing behind her. Others said she lifted her arms, signaling frantically at passing cars. But no one stopped, and by the next morning, Carmen was gone. On November 18th, 2 days after her disappearance, hunters made a grim discovery. Carmen's body was found discarded in a gully off the highway near Churchville, about 15 miles from her home. She had been strangled. The bruises on her body spoke of a violent struggle. Torn clothing told investigators she had fought desperately against her attacker. 10 years old, alone, terrified, fighting until the end. The investigators who stood over her body that morning carried away more than evidence. They carried a silence, an unspoken recognition that something had changed. A predator was loose in Rochester. The Colon family grieved under the weight of disbelief. Carmen's casket was heartbreakingly small, her life brutally shortened. Relatives whispered questions no one could answer. Her schoolmates stared at her empty desk, learning for the first time that childhood did not make you untouchable. Parents began watching their children more closely. Neighborhoods that once rang with the sounds of play grew quieter. The laughter of children was replaced by the echo of fear. But Rochester did not yet know the truth. Carmen was not an isolated tragedy. She was the first, the warning sign no one recognized. Her initials, C. Carmen Colon. The place she was found, Churchville. At first, the connection seemed meaningless, just coincidence. Nobody stopped to think much of it. But 2 years later, when another girl went missing, the pattern would leap from coincidence into something monstrous. And by then, Rochester would learn it was living with a killer who played by rules no one could understand. The press would give him a name, one that still hangs in the shadows of true crime history: the alphabet killer. By 1973, the city of Rochester had begun to let its guard down. Carmen Colon's death, while unforgettable, was fading into the tragic archives of memory. Parents still worried, yes, but the rhythm of life has a way of dulling fear over time. Factories still rumbled, buses still clattered down Main Street, and children still walked home from school with brown paper bags clutched in their arms. But in April of 1973, the wound reopened. This time, the killer didn't lurk on a highway. He stepped into the middle of everyday life, into the path of another little girl. Her name was Wanda Walkowicz. She was 11 years old. Wanda lived with her mother and younger siblings on Avenue D, in one of Rochester's tougher neighborhoods. Life in the Walkowicz household wasn't easy. Her mother struggled with health problems and worked hard to keep food on the table. Wanda, despite her age, often stepped in to help. She looked after her younger sisters, ran errands, and shouldered responsibility beyond her years. Those who knew her remember her as shy but dependable, a child with quiet strength. She had her routines, her favorite corners of the neighborhood, the friends she would walk with after school. She was the kind of girl who, when sent to the store, always came back, until the day she didn't. On April 2nd, 1973, Wanda was asked to do a simple chore: pick up groceries from the local store. It was only a short walk. She carried her change, bought a few essentials, bread, milk, a tin of food, and started back home with the bag in her arms. But somewhere between the store and her front door, Wanda disappeared. When she failed to return, her mother grew anxious. The groceries were never delivered, and the minutes began to drag into hours. By nightfall, panic set in. Neighbors were asked if they'd seen her. Some had: a small girl with a paper bag, walking steadily along her route. But then, nothing. She had vanished into the ordinary streets of Rochester. The next day, a search party fanned out through the area. Their grim work ended by the banks of the Genesee River. There, Wanda's body was discovered. Like Carmen before her, she had been strangled. Evidence on her body suggested a struggle, but also something more. She had been assaulted. The killer had taken his time, had carried out his cruelty with calculation. The groceries she had been carrying were later found spilled near her home, as though she had almost made it back. Almost. The thought cut deep. She had been within sight of safety, only to be pulled away forever. For Rochester, the memory of Carmen Colon came flooding back. Another young girl, same age, same brutal ending. The whispers began almost immediately. Could this be the same killer? And then, the pattern emerged again. Wanda Walkowicz. WW. Her body discovered near Webster. 2 girls, 2 years apart, both with matching initials. Both discarded in towns that matched those initials. Coincidence had now become suspicion. Suspicion hardened into fear. Wanda's funeral drew a crowd of mourners shaken by the cruelty of her death. Children from her school, clutching flowers, stood silently beside their parents. The priest's words echoed through the church. But outside, conversations turned toward a darker question. Was there a predator among them? someone who studied children, who chose them according to a secret game of letters. Parents began escorting their children everywhere. Trust evaporated. The community had become a hunting ground, and the hunter was still loose. With Wanda's murder, the press seized on the growing connection between the two cases. The name, the Alphabet Killer, began to appear in headlines. And with that name, fear took on a new, sharper edge. This was not random violence. This was a killer who had rules. Rules that made sense only to him. And as Rochester struggled to breathe under the weight of this second tragedy, none could have known that he wasn't finished. That one more girl, another child with matching letters, would soon fall into his grasp. Her name was Michelle Maenza. By the fall of 1973, Rochester was living in quiet dread. Parents watched their children with anxious eyes. Strangers were no longer simply neighbors. They were potential threats. Two girls, Carmen and Wanda, had already been taken. Two funerals had already left their mark on the city's soul. And then, on a chilly day in November, the Alphabet Killer struck again. Her name was Michelle Menza. She was just 10 years old, a child with a warm smile and a trusting nature who lived with her parents and siblings in Rochester. Michelle was well loved in her community, though some described her as shy, even vulnerable. She carried the kind of innocence that made adults instinctively protective of her. On November 26th, 1973, Michelle walked home from school like she had done so many times before. The path was familiar. Sidewalks she knew by heart, corners where she and her friends laughed and lingered. But this time, she never made it home. Witnesses later reported seeing Michelle getting into a tan-colored car with a man. Some claimed he looked friendly, that he had spoken to her calmly. It seemed, at first, like a ride home from someone she might have known. But Michelle never arrived. When she didn't return by nightfall, her parents called the police. By now, Rochester knew what it meant when a child vanished. A sickening familiarity returned. The waiting, the searching, the whispering of neighbors gathering on porches. Everyone feared the same thing, that the Alphabet Killer had struck again. The following day, Michelle's body was found in a ditch off a country road in Macedon, just outside Rochester. She had been raped and strangled. The marks of her final moments were written clearly on her small frame. A struggle, a desperate attempt to survive. Investigators would later reveal that she bore injuries consistent with being tied up, as though her killer had restrained her before ending her life. Her shoes were missing when she was discovered, a detail that puzzled detectives. Some believed it was part of the killer's ritual. Some believed it was meant to humiliate. Others thought it was merely a way of erasing evidence. Whatever the reason, it was another layer of cruelty in a case already overflowing with it. Her initials, MM. Her body found in Macedon. Now, there was no denying it. The killer was choosing children according to a system only he understood. The same initials in their names and in the towns where they were discarded. Carmen Kalan in Churchville, Wanda Walkowicz near Webster, and now Michelle Menza in Macedon. 3 children, 3 funerals, 3 matching patterns. Rochester's fear hardened into hysteria. Parents no longer let their children walk to school alone. Police patrols swept neighborhoods in vain. Every man with a tan car, every stranger who lingered too long, every neighbor who seemed even slightly unusual was whispered about. The alphabet killer had become more than a murderer. He was a ghost story walking in daylight. When Michelle was laid to rest, the grief felt heavier than before. By now, families knew this was no isolated tragedy. It was a pattern, a hunt, and Rochester itself was the hunting ground. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter as they left the church. Strangers avoided each other's eyes. And hanging above the crowd was the name whispered in every household, every schoolyard, every corner store: the Alphabet Killer. With Michelle's death, the city reached a breaking point. 3 young girls, all between 10 and 11, all with matching initials, all strangled, all dumped in matching towns. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was design, a cruel design. And the question was no longer if there would be another victim, but when. But as the city braced itself for another tragedy, something strange happened. The Alphabet Killer never struck again, at least not in Rochester. When Michelle Mensa's body was discovered in November 1973, Rochester's fear transformed into obsession. The pattern was undeniable. 3 girls, 3 sets of matching initials, 3 towns that matched their names. It was the work of someone who wasn't just killing. He was playing a game. For police, the Alphabet murders became one of the most intense investigations in Rochester's history. Detectives worked around the clock. The FBI was called in. Leads poured in from across the city. Yet, despite the urgency, the killer seemed to vanish into thin air after Michelle's death. This chapter is the story of that pursuit, of dead ends, false leads, suspects who slipped away, and a case that remains unsolved to this day. Each crime scene told a story, but none gave enough to identify the killer. Carmen Calan fought desperately. Scratches on her body suggested she had resisted with all her strength, but her attacker had been stronger. The highway sightings suggested she may have even escaped briefly before being dragged back. Wanda Walkowicz's body showed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Investigators found traces of white cat hair on her clothing, though her family didn't own a cat. That tiny clue suggested the killer had a pet, or had been in a house with one. Michelle Mensa's injuries were brutal. Some evidence suggested she had been tied up, and her missing shoes hinted at a ritualistic element. Witnesses recalled seeing a man coax her into a tan-colored car. Together, these details painted the picture of a predator who planned his attacks, controlled his victims, and left behind just enough fragments to taunt investigators. The Rochester Police Department poured resources into the case. Over 800 leads were chased. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Patrols were increased near schools and neighborhoods. The community was on high alert. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit became involved, creating one of the earliest criminal profiles of a serial killer. They suggested the alphabet killer was likely a white male in his 20s to 30s, familiar with the neighborhoods and possibly driving a tan or light-colored car. Yet for all the manpower, the killer stayed out of reach. Over the years, several names rose to the surface, each one carrying the weight of possibility before fading again into doubt. Perhaps the most famous suspect, Kenneth Bianchi, would later be known as one of the Hillside Stranglers, responsible for a string of murders in Los Angeles during the late 1970s. Bianchi grew up in Rochester. At the time of the alphabet murders, he was in his early 20s and worked as an ice cream vendor, a job that gave him easy access to children. He also drove a car similar to the one described in Michelle Mensa's abduction. When questioned years later, Bianchi denied involvement. DNA testing conducted in the early 2000s compared him to evidence recovered from Wanda Walkowicz's body. The results ruled him out. Still, many in Rochester believe he may have been involved, if not directly, then connected somehow. Another chilling possibility was Joseph Nasso, a serial killer active in California during the 1970s and 1980s. Like the Rochester murders, Nasso's victims often had matching initials, earning him the nickname the Alphabet Killer decades later. Nasso kept detailed journals of his crimes, documenting the names and initials of women he killed. When he was arrested in 2010, investigators immediately noticed the eerie similarity to the Rochester case. But there was no direct evidence linking Nasso to Rochester in the early 1970s. Without proof he had ever been in the city at that time, the connection remained circumstantial. Police also investigated several men within Rochester itself. A neighbor of Wanda's, who was known for inappropriate behavior around children. A family acquaintance of Michelle's who owned a tan car and lived near her school. A man who worked at a local garage and had access to multiple vehicles. All were questioned. All failed to yield enough evidence for an arrest. The cat hair. One of the strangest pieces of evidence came from Wanda's body, white cat hairs. Investigators scoured Rochester for known offenders who owned such pets. Dozens of men were investigated because of that single clue. But nothing concrete ever emerged. As weeks turned to months and months into years, the city of Rochester carried the weight of fear like a shadow. Parents held their children closer. Schools drilled safety routines. Strangers eyed each other with suspicion. The newspapers dubbed the case the Alphabet Murders, and with that name, the killer became a mythic figure. Faceless, omnipresent, terrifying. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't how he killed, but why he stopped. Serial killers rarely just quit. Did he move to another city? Did he end up in prison for another crime? Did he die, taking his secret with him? Or was it possible the police had interviewed him, even shaken his hand, without realizing they were face to face with the Alphabet Killer? The murders ended with Michelle Mensa. No more matching initial girls were found in Rochester. For some, that was a relief. For others, it was a sign he had simply moved on, and that somewhere else, more children suffered under his pattern. Decades later, the Alphabet murders remain unsolved. DNA evidence has been retested with modern technology. Suspects have been revisited, but no definitive answers have ever emerged. For the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle, the grief never faded. Their daughters' names became etched into Rochester's history, not as children who grew up and lived full lives, but as victims of a shadow that still has no face. The Alphabet Killer is more than a true crime case. He is a reminder of the fragility of safety, of how quickly innocence can be stolen. Rochester, a city that once thrummed with the sound of children's laughter, was changed forever in the span of 2 years. Three children bound together by tragedy and by the cruel logic of their killer's system. Carmen Colon, C.C., Churchville, Vanda Valkovich, WWW, Webster, Michelle Maenza, M.M., Macedon. Three names, three funerals, three unanswered questions. The Alphabet Killer remains a ghost in the annals of crime, a man who turned the alphabet itself into a weapon and who slipped back into the shadows before anyone could drag him into the light. And so the case endures, not just as an unsolved mystery, but as a story of children whose laughter was silenced and a city that still waits for a name that may never come. Find this dark? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Dark Matter Crimes to keep getting true crime stories like this.